What if I told you that ancient Egypt, the land of towering pyramids, enigmatic sphinxes, and powerful pharaohs, holds secrets so profound they could completely transform how you understand the Bible? From the great exodus of the Israelites to the refuge of Jesus himself, Egypt appears in the Bible again and again, not just as a backdrop, but as a key player in God's unfolding story. But here's the mystery. Why is Egypt, often viewed as a symbol of rebellion and idolatry, also described as a place of refuge, wisdom, and even redemption? What if the pyramids' alignment with the stars wasn't just about astronomy, but a reflection of sacred knowledge tied to the creation itself? What if the plagues of Egypt weren't merely divine punishments, but deliberate strikes against the nation's most powerful gods, exposing their spiritual frailty? And what if the laws of Moses, the foundation of Israel's covenant, were shaped by divine truths already glimpsed within Egypt's wisdom? What did the priests of Egypt know about the mysteries of creation, the structure of time, and the spiritual order of the universe? Why does the Bible reference Egypt more than any nation outside of Israel? And here's the most intriguing question of all. Did Egypt possess forbidden knowledge, truths that align with God's plan, but were hidden from the rest of the world? In today's video, we're diving headfirst into the untold story of ancient Egypt's role in biblical history. Prepare to uncover the connections between sacred wisdom, divine rebellion, and cosmic prophecy as we explore why this ancient civilization may have known far more about the Bible than we ever imagined. What if Egypt was not only a rival to Israel, but also its mirror, holding pieces of a divine puzzle we've yet to put together? Why does the Bible keep bringing us back to Egypt? From the patriarchs to Jesus himself, Egypt isn't just a distant foreign nation. It becomes a place of pivotal, divine encounters. Take Abraham, for example. During a devastating famine, where did he turn? Not to Canaan, the land of promise, but to Egypt. Genesis 12:10. This decision saved his family, but it also served as a testing ground. Abraham lied to Pharaoh about Sarah being his sister, yet God protected them and even blessed Abraham through this trial. Why would God allow his chosen one to find safety in the very land later known for its idolatry? Could it be that Egypt was part of his plan all along? Now think about Joseph, a young dreamer betrayed by his brothers and sold into slavery. Where did his story take a dramatic turn? In Egypt, Genesis 41. Through God's guidance, Joseph rose to become Pharaoh's second in command, saving not only Egypt, but also his own family from starvation. Imagine the irony. The land that enslaved God's people centuries later was first a place of rescue. Isn't it fascinating how God uses unlikely places and people to fulfill his divine purposes? And then there's Jesus, the Savior of the world, fleeing to Egypt as a child, Matthew 2:13 and 15. Herod's soldiers sought to destroy him, yet Egypt, the symbolic land of bondage, became his sanctuary. The Bible tells us this fulfilled prophecy, "Out of Egypt I called my son," Hosea 11:01. Could it be that Egypt's role as a place of refuge is no coincidence, but a deliberate pattern in God's unfolding story? What is it about Egypt that God keeps weaving it into his plans? Could it hold secrets about redemption, justice, and divine intervention that we've overlooked? Now let's zoom out to the bigger story. The Israelites' 400-year sojourn in Egypt, Exodus 12:40. This wasn't just history. It was a spiritual transformation on a massive scale. When Jacob and his family settled in Egypt during a famine, it was under the protection of Joseph. They prospered, multiplying into a great nation. But prosperity didn't last. A new Pharaoh, who did not know Joseph, rose to power, Exodus 1:8. The Israelites were enslaved, forced to build monuments for Pharaoh's glory. Why would God allow his chosen people to endure such suffering? Here's where the story takes a powerful turn. Egypt, often seen as a symbol of idolatry and human pride, became the stage for God's greatest display of power. Through Moses, God unleashed the 10 plagues, challenging Egypt's gods one by one, and proved his sovereignty. For example, the Nile turning to blood defied Hapi, the god of the Nile. The plague of darkness mocked Ra, the sun god. The death of the firstborn exposed Pharaoh's impotence as a so-called divine ruler. Each plague wasn't just a punishment. It was a declaration that the God of Israel reigns supreme. But let's not forget the deeper spiritual lesson. While Egypt enslaved God's people, it also shaped them. Through their suffering, the Israelites learned to depend fully on God. The Exodus wasn't just a physical liberation, it was a transformation of identity. They left Egypt as slaves, but became God's covenant people. Here's the paradox of Egypt in the Bible. It's both a symbol of rebellion against God and a place of redemption. Egypt's wealth and power often led to pride and idolatry, yet time and again, God used Egypt to protect his people, test their faith, and reveal his glory. Egypt is where God's people experienced their deepest suffering, but also where they witnessed his mightiest miracles, the parting of the Red Sea, the provision of manna, and the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. All these pivotal events are tied to their exodus from Egypt. But here's a question worth pondering. Could Egypt's dual role be a reflection of our own spiritual journeys? Like Egypt, we are capable of both rebellion and redemption. And just as God redeemed his people from Egypt, he offers to redeem us from our own bondage. Whether it's sin, fear, or doubt. Egypt's creation myths, shadows of biblical truth. Book. Egypt's ancient stories of creation echo the very truths we find in Genesis. The Ennead, a central piece of Egyptian cosmology, begins with the primordial waters, a shapeless, formless chaos that birthed creation. Doesn't that sound familiar? Genesis 1:02 says, "Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters." Could it be that the Egyptians glimpsed fragments of God's truth, but through a distorted lens? In their myths, creation begins with a spoken word. The god Atum speaks, and life emerges. Compare this to Genesis 1:03, where God declares, "Let there be light," and it was so. The Egyptians also believed in the breath of life as the force that animates creation, much like Genesis 2:7, where God breathes life into Adam. How could two vastly different cultures align so closely in their understanding of creation? These similarities aren't just coincidences. They point to something deeper, a shared memory of God's divine act, preserved imperfectly by the Egyptians. But here's the twist. While Egypt's myths revered creation as the work of many gods, the Bible reveals the truth. One sovereign creator, the God of Israel, Egypt's knowledge of divine order. Now let's shift our gaze to something even more astounding, Egypt's understanding of time. The Great Pyramid at Giza, one of the wonders of the ancient world, isn't just a monument, it's a celestial clock. Its alignment with the stars and the cardinal directions reflects a precise knowledge of cosmic order. Did the Egyptians understand the divine rhythms of creation better than we think? Their solar calendar, remarkably accurate, consisted of 365 days and mirrored the Book of Jubilee's emphasis on sacred time. Unlike the lunar calendars used by many ancient cultures, Egypt's solar calendar sought to align with the movements of the heavens. Was this an inherited fragment of God's divine design? Could Egypt's advanced timekeeping have originated from truths revealed by God but later misused or misunderstood? While Egypt seemed to master the mechanics of time, they missed its purpose. God's sacred calendar wasn't about precision alone. It was about alignment with His will. This is why the Sabbath and festivals in the Bible hold such spiritual importance. Egypt might have had the knowledge, but they lacked the relationship with the one who ordained it. The 10 plagues, a spiritual showdown. When we think of the plagues in Egypt, we often focus on their physical devastation. But what if the plagues were more than punishment? What if they were strategic strikes against Egypt's gods, exposing their powerlessness before the Almighty? Consider the Nile turning to blood, Exodus chapter 7 verses 14 to 24. To the Egyptians, the Nile wasn't just a river, it was a god named Hapi, the source of life and fertility. By turning it to blood, God wasn't merely disrupting their water supply, he was dismantling their faith in Hapi's power. Or think about the plague of darkness, Exodus 10, 21 through 29. For 3 days the land of Egypt was covered in thick darkness, a direct challenge to Ra, the sun god, whom the Egyptians revered as the giver of light and life. Yet, in Goshen, where God's people lived, there was light. What clearer sign could there be that the God of Israel reigns supreme over all creation? Each plague was deliberate. Each plague was a judgment not just on Pharaoh's hardened heart, but on the spiritual forces behind Egypt's gods. These events weren't random acts of destruction. They were part of a cosmic battle, revealing that the gods of Egypt were mere illusions. Do you see now? The plagues weren't just punishments. They were declarations of God's unmatched authority. Ancient Egypt wasn't just a civilization of breathtaking monuments and powerful pharaohs. It was a society where the priests, custodians of secret knowledge, held profound insights into the mysteries of life, the cosmos, and the divine. They studied astronomy, medicine, and theology, blending these fields into a unique spiritual framework. Could it be that these priests, in their pursuit of wisdom, uncovered truths about creation that align with God's plan? The Bible hints at this deeper connection. Acts 7:22 tells us that Moses, before he became the leader of Israel, was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. Imagine this. Moses, a Hebrew child, saved from death, grows up immersed in the heart of Egypt's royal and religious knowledge. As a prince in Pharaoh's court, he likely had access to the libraries, the priesthood, and the teachings on the natural and supernatural order. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. What if God allowed Moses to learn these mysteries, not for Egypt's glory, but to use them later for his divine purposes? Moses may have been raised to serve Pharaoh, but God had other plans. He would take the very knowledge Moses learned in Egypt and repurpose it to establish his covenant with Israel. Now think about the Egyptian priests themselves. They gazed at the heavens, charting the movements of stars and planets with astonishing accuracy. They practiced medicine with techniques that were advanced for their time. Their temples weren't just places of worship. They were meticulously constructed to align with celestial patterns, showcasing their understanding of the universe. But for all their wisdom, the Egyptians worshipped false gods, idols crafted by human hands. Could this be why God allowed their wisdom to be redirected through Moses to reveal his truth to the world? One of the most striking examples of Egypt's influence appears in the design of the tabernacle, the portable sanctuary God instructed Moses to build in the wilderness, Exodus 25. Why is this significant? Because the tabernacle wasn't just a random tent. Its dimensions, materials, and layout were divinely inspired, but they also reveal parallels to Egyptian architecture. The Egyptians were masters of sacred geometry. Their temples were designed with mathematical precision, reflecting a deep understanding of symmetry, proportion, and balance. These principles weren't merely aesthetic, they symbolized the harmony of creation and the order of the universe. The pyramids themselves are a testament to this knowledge, aligned perfectly with the cardinal points and celestial bodies. When God gave Moses the instructions for the tabernacle, he may have allowed Moses to draw from this architectural wisdom, but with one critical difference. The tabernacle would not glorify Egypt's gods or human achievement. It would glorify the one true God. Unlike the temples of Egypt, which housed idols, the tabernacle housed the Ark of the Covenant, the physical representation of God's presence among his people. Could God have used the Egyptians' knowledge of geometry and structure as a foundation, only to reshape it into something holy? The very skills that the Egyptians used to build temples to Ra or Osiris were transformed into tools for worshiping Yahweh. It's as if God took what was meant for idolatry and redeemed it for his glory. The layout of the tabernacle shares striking similarities with Egyptian temples. Both feature outer courts, holy places, and sanctuaries reserved for the divine presence. Both structures emphasize the sacredness of space, moving from the profane to the holy. But here's the key difference. While Egyptian temples were centered on human access to false gods, the tabernacle was designed for God's access to humanity. The tabernacle was a place where heaven and earth met, a mobile sanctuary that moved with God's people. Its construction demonstrated not only God's desire to dwell among his people, but also his power to transform human knowledge into divine revelation. What other examples of Egypt's knowledge might God have redeemed for his purposes? If Moses, trained in Egypt's wisdom, could use that knowledge to serve God's purposes, what might God be teaching you through the world around you? Could it be that the skills, talents, or experiences you've gained, even those rooted in imperfect or worldly systems, are being prepared for something greater? Leave a comment and let us know. Do you think God uses the knowledge of the world to fulfill his divine plan? Moses and the Ten Commandments parallels with Egypt's Ma'at. Before Moses ever ascended Mount Sinai, he spent years immersed in Egyptian culture as a prince in Pharaoh's court. The Egyptians had a central belief system called Ma'at, symbolized by a feather, representing truth, justice, and cosmic balance. Ma'at wasn't just an idea, it was a way of life, governing how the Egyptians treated one another and maintained harmony in society. They believed living by Ma'at kept them aligned with the order of creation. Doesn't this sound strikingly similar to the principles of the Ten Commandments? You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not murder. These laws resonate with Ma'at's emphasis on moral integrity and justice. But here's where it gets even more intriguing. God didn't merely borrow from Egyptian culture. He perfected and sanctified these principles, making them eternal and binding, not just for one nation, but for all his people. The Ten Commandments weren't about balancing the cosmos like Ma'at. They were about restoring humanity's relationship with God and one another. Moses wasn't copying Egypt. God was reclaiming and elevating truth for his divine purposes. So here's the question. Could Moses' exposure to Egyptian concepts of order have been part of God's plan to prepare him for delivering his eternal law? Did God take what was good in Egypt and transform it into something holy? Egypt wasn't just a land of wealth and monuments. It was a center of knowledge, unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. Imagine vast libraries filled with scrolls and tablets, holding secrets about astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and theology. One of the most famous was the Library of Alexandria, though it came much later, a testament to Egypt's thirst for preserving knowledge. But here's the twist. Did Egypt preserve fragments of divine truths that were lost to other nations? Could their wisdom about creation, the order of the universe, and morality reflect remnants of knowledge passed down from Noah's descendants after the flood? The Egyptians built their lives around concepts like sacred time, astronomical cycles, and divine justice. Many of these align with themes we find in the Bible. Their precise solar calendar, for example, closely resembles the one described in the Book of Jubilees. Was this an accident, or could it point to a deeper, God-given understanding that Egypt preserved even as they worshipped false gods? God's plan to redeem wisdom from Egypt. Let's go back to Moses. As a prince in Egypt, Moses would have been taught the mysteries of Egyptian science, leadership, and theology. Yet God called him out of that world into the wilderness to prepare him for something far greater. Moses' life is proof that God can use even the wisdom of nations that oppose him for his divine purposes. When Moses confronted Pharaoh, armed with God's power, it wasn't just a battle of wills. It was a demonstration that the wisdom and gods of Egypt were nothing compared to the God of Israel. But instead of discarding Egypt's knowledge entirely, God redefined it. The principles of truth, justice, and order became the foundation for Israel's covenant, a covenant centered on love, holiness, and obedience to the one true God. What can we learn from Egypt's influence? So what does this mean for us? First, it reminds us that God's truth is eternal, and He can redeem knowledge from any culture, any time, for His glory. Second, it challenges us to seek wisdom with discernment, asking, how can we align what we learn with God's eternal word? Finally, it inspires us to recognize that God's plans are never accidental. Even Egypt's rise as a superpower was part of His story, setting the stage for His people's deliverance and their spiritual transformation. Egypt, a symbol of rebellion and redemption. The collective psychos. Egypt as a place of testing, a nation caught between divine sovereignty and false worship. What does it mean for a nation to become both a cradle of wisdom and a battlefield of spiritual rebellion? Ancient Egypt, so central to the story of the Bible, carries this paradox within its very soul. The Exodus, one of the most dramatic events in human history, wasn't just a political liberation or an act of rebellion against an earthly king. It was a cosmic battle between the true God of heaven and the false powers of this world. Pharaoh's hardened heart. Imagine the might of Pharaoh, considered a god by his people, standing defiantly before Moses as he says, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice?" Exodus 5 verse 02. Pharaoh's hardened heart represents more than personal stubbornness. It is a picture of humanity's collective rebellion against God's sovereignty. A refusal to bow to the one who holds all creation in his hands. But why did God allow Pharaoh's heart to harden? God wasn't just dealing with Pharaoh's pride. He was revealing His unmatched power to Egypt and to the world. Each plague, blood in the Nile, darkness over the land, the death of the firstborn, was a direct challenge to Egypt's gods. The Nile, worshipped as a giver of life, became a river of death. The sun god Ra was powerless to dispel the darkness. Every false power fell silent before the true Creator. The Exodus, a spiritual battle of cosmic proportions. The Exodus is often seen as a political event, but it was far more profound. It was a showdown between God and the spiritual forces behind Egypt's idolatry. The gods of Egypt weren't just harmless myths. They represented powers and principalities opposed to God's divine plan. The Israelites, enslaved and surrounded by the grandeur of Egypt's temples, would have questioned whether their God was stronger than Egypt's gods. Each plague wasn't just judgment, it was a revelation. God was declaring, "I alone am sovereign over the earth, the skies, and the depths of the sea." Why did God choose to let His people suffer so long before the Exodus? Could it be that the suffering in Egypt was meant to purify their faith, teaching them to rely on Him alone? Here's the paradox. Egypt was both a place of profound wisdom and spiritual rebellion. Its advanced knowledge of architecture, astronomy, and medicine is awe-inspiring. The pyramids themselves were built with precision that still baffles modern engineers. Could this wisdom have been a reflection of truths originally revealed by God, but later distorted? The Bible paints Egypt as a nation that stood in opposition to God's people. Yet it also describes Egypt as a place of refuge. Abraham found safety there during famine. Joseph rose to power in its courts, saving countless lives. Even Jesus was sheltered in Egypt as a child, fulfilling Christ's all commands, providing providence and making the land for His mourner. But why would God allow His Son to seek refuge in a land synonymous with idolatry? Could it be that Egypt, despite its rebellion, always had a role in God's redemptive plan? Lunak 2, Egyptian Afterlife and Resurrection, Shadows of Greater Truths. Now let's delve deeper into Egypt's spiritual legacy. One of its most fascinating beliefs was in the resurrection of the dead. The story of Osiris, the god who died and was brought back to life, was central to Egyptian religion. The pyramids themselves were elaborate tombs designed to guide the dead into the afterlife. But here's the question. Were these beliefs echoes of deeper truths revealed by God? The Egyptian obsession with life after death reflects a universal longing, a truth that God later fulfilled in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. While the Egyptians sought eternal life through rituals and monuments, Jesus offered it freely through his sacrifice. Isn't it remarkable that centuries before Christ walked the earth, Egypt was already grappling with the concept of resurrection? Their vision was imperfect, but it points to humanity's innate desire for eternity, a longing that only Jesus can truly satisfy. Could the resurrection story of Osiris be a distorted shadow of the ultimate truth, the resurrection of Christ? What if I told you that Egypt, once a land of pagan gods and hardened pharaohs, will play a pivotal role in God's ultimate plan for humanity? It may sound surprising, even controversial, but the Bible is clear. Egypt is not abandoned. Its story doesn't end with the plagues, the Exodus, or its opposition to God's people. Instead, Egypt is destined to be redeemed and to stand as a testament to God's grace, justice, and mercy. In that day, the prophetic vision of Egypt's redemption. The prophet Isaiah gives us a glimpse into Egypt's future like no other. He speaks of a time when this ancient nation, long seen as a symbol of oppression and idolatry, will be drawn into God's divine plan. In that day, there will be an altar to the Lord in the heart of Egypt, and a monument to the Lord at its border. Isaiah chapter 19 verse 9. Did you hear that? An altar to the Lord in the heart of Egypt. What does that mean? Can you imagine Egypt, a nation once consumed by worship of Ra, Osiris, and Anubis, now worshiping the one true God? The God of souls and spirits, and of all life. Isaiah's words challenge us to see beyond the Egypt we know from the Exodus story. He describes a day when Egypt will cry out to the Lord, and he will send them a savior and defender. Isaiah chapter 19 verse 20. This is a staggering prophecy, one that flips the script of Egypt's biblical role. Instead of rebellion and judgment, we see reconciliation and redemption, a spiritual transformation in the heart of Egypt. Imagine the Nile River no longer being a symbol of false gods, but a land flowing with praises to Yahweh. Imagine the pyramids, once monuments to human pride, overshadowed by a new altar dedicated to the God of Israel. This isn't just poetic language. Isaiah is describing a complete spiritual transformation, a moment when Egypt turns from its past and embraces the eternal truths of God. He writes, "The Lord will make himself known to the Egyptians, and in that day they will acknowledge the Lord." Isaiah chapter 19 verse 21. This isn't just about Egypt. It's a sign of what's to come for all nations. If God's grace can reach Egypt, can it reach even the hardest hearts today? Isaiah's prophecy doesn't stop there. He envisions a highway connecting Egypt, Israel, and Assyria, three nations united in worshiping the Lord. He declares, "Blessed be Egypt, my people, Assyria, my handiwork, and Israel, my inheritance." Isaiah 19:25. This is no ordinary alliance. These three nations, often depicted in the Bible as adversaries, are brought together in God's ultimate plan. Egypt, which was once a place of oppression for the Israelites, will now share in God's blessings. Can you imagine that? The same Egypt that enslaved God's people will one day kneel before him in worship. Egypt's story doesn't just point to its redemption. It mirrors God's greater plan for the entire world. Ancient Egyptians longed for Ma'at, the divine order that kept their universe in balance. But this yearning for harmony was incomplete. Their gods failed them. their idols crumbled, and their kingdoms fell. Yet the vision of New Jerusalem in Revelation fulfills what Egypt and all humanity has always longed for. In Revelation 21, we see a city where God's glory fills every corner, where nations walk in His light, and where every tear is wiped away. The New Jerusalem is the ultimate realization of divine order and eternal harmony, a promise that stretches back to the beginnings of history. Could it be that Egypt's ancient yearning for divine order was pointing to something far greater? Was it a shadow of the eternal harmony that will be found in the New Jerusalem? Located in the center of the rest of Egypt, the Jerusalem Egyptian. Egypt's story teaches us one of the most powerful lessons in the Bible. No one is beyond God's grace. Even a nation that stood against Him, a nation that worshipped idols and oppressed His people, is not excluded from His love and mercy. Blessed are the peaceful, for faith and hope in the Lord. This prophecy challenges us to think about the people and places we consider too far gone. If God can redeem Egypt, He can redeem anyone. And if He can unite Egypt, Israel, and Assyria in worship, He can bring peace to the deepest divisions in our world today. What if Egypt's ancient wisdom, knowledge of creation, divine order, and sacred time was not forbidden, but hidden in plain sight? A treasure lost to the shadows of idolatry, waiting for us to rediscover it. Could it be that in understanding Egypt's biblical significance, we uncover a deeper layer of God's universal plan for redemption? Let's reflect on what we've uncovered today. Egypt wasn't just another nation mentioned in the Bible. It was a cradle of civilization, a place where spiritual mysteries and divine revelations seemed to intersect with human history. Abraham sought refuge in Egypt. Joseph saved Egypt and his family from famine. These weren't coincidences. They were part of a divine pattern. More scholars suspect the second commandment was meant for Jeremiah. Isaac fell descended from God among the pilgrims from Egypt. Abraham sought refuge in Egypt. Joseph saved Egypt and his family, even though it became a presentment. The last person to be executed in the United States for crimes was a person raised in the state of Israel. This became a boon for God, held together only by grace righteousness. No peaceful person uses God to seduce their people, even the most dreadful. Egypt was also a symbol of rebellion, pride, and false worship. Its spiritual wisdom was overshadowed by its idolatry, a stark reminder that even the greatest knowledge can be corrupted when detached from God. And yet God didn't abandon Egypt. In Isaiah 19, He promises a future where Egypt will worship Him, standing side by side with Israel. So what does this mean for us? Could Egypt's forgotten wisdom, buried beneath centuries of history, be a key to understanding God's plan for humanity? Take a moment to reflect. What does Egypt's story teach us about our own journey of faith? How can a nation once mired in false gods become a symbol of redemption in God's ultimate plan? These are not just questions about history, they're questions about hope. They remind us that no matter how far we stray, God's mercy and purpose can redeem and transform. Now we want to hear from you. Do you believe that Egypt held divine knowledge that shaped the Bible? What parts of today's story surprised or inspired you? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your insights. If this journey into Egypt's biblical significance has resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with someone who loves exploring the hidden layers of the Bible. Together, we can uncover more of these truths and grow in our understanding of God's plan. And don't forget, like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss future explorations into the mysteries of faith and history. Your support helps us continue diving deeper into these profound topics. Egypt's story reminds us of a profound truth. God's plan for redemption isn't limited by borders, nations, or time. He weaves his story through the rise and fall of civilizations, through faithful believers and even those who oppose him. And if he can take a place like Egypt, known for its idolatry, and promise its future redemption, imagine what he can do with our lives when we turn to him. And so let this be a reminder. The Bible is more than a book of stories. It's a divine tapestry with threads running through places like Egypt, connecting us to a God who never stops redeeming and restoring. Keep seeking, keep questioning,